In early 2018, a woman in her 52nd stood in her Austin, Texas bedroom doorway, firing shots from her 357 revolver into the dark kitchen in front of her. Someone in the kitchen fired back at her, and bullets tore through the house as she aimed at shadows but missed. When her gun finally emptied, she fled to her closet to hide. Later, detectives found a chaotic scene in the kitchen, bullet casings everywhere, a middle-aged man dead on the floor, and a handgun near his hand. The woman claimed intruders had broken in, killed her husband, and fled when she opened fire. Detectives, however, began to suspect that the scene was staged to cover up something darker, possibly a wife killing her husband. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the follow buttons colored laundry. But instead of using detergent, just use bleach. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of March 1st, 2018, 55-year-old Ted Shaughnessy placed a necklace in a glass display case in his high-end jewelry store in Austin, Texas. Ted adjusted his glasses on his face and then leaned in a bit closer, and he saw the lights in the case bounce off the golden jewels in this necklace, and it was so beautiful he just smiled. He and his wife, Corey, had owned this jewelry store for 20 years. Corey had a keen eye for jewelry, so she worked as the appraiser, choosing which pieces to buy and then sell inside of the store, and also determining how much they were worth. And Ted was a great salesman. Ted took pride in the way he displayed the jewelry in the store. He wanted to draw the customers in, and then, once they were there, Ted would approach them like they were lifelong friends. Now, part of the reason he did this was just because it was an effective sales tactic. But also, Ted really did love meeting and talking with people who came in to shop off the street. That's actually one of the reasons he'd worked in retail for most of his adult life. Ted locked the display case and walked around the shop, turning off lights and closing things up for the day. Then he set the security alarm, headed out the door, and locked it behind him. Some nights Ted would stay at the jewelry store long after it had closed to go over the books or to redo the displays. But tonight he wanted to get home as quickly as he could. He and his wife had plans to spend the entire night doing one of their favorite things: eating a great home-cooked meal together and just relaxing and watching TV. After leaving the store, Ted climbed into his car and headed home. About 25 minutes later, he pulled into his neighborhood and he looked around at all the huge houses with sprawling front yards and swimming pools out back. He found his house, which was just as big as all the others, and he pulled into the long driveway and came to a stop. He got out of the car, walked inside his house through the front door, and the moment he was inside, he was hit with this wonderful smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. But before he could even call out to his wife, he heard loud clacking sounds on the hardwood floors as two large dogs bounded through the front room towards him. Ted enthusiastically knelt down and began goofing around with the dogs and asking them how they were doing, like they could answer back. Then he stood back up, and the dogs followed at his heels as Ted made his way through the house, which could feel like walking through a maze for somebody who had never been there. Ted and the dogs got to the kitchen, and Ted saw his wife, Corey, standing over the stove. Corey turned around and Ted immediately walked over, put his hands on her waist, and gave her a kiss. Ted helped his wife put some finishing touches on the meal, and then they both got excited about the night ahead of them. They knew a lot of people would find this to be a pretty boring way to spend the night, but Ted and Corey really were never happier than when they were just hanging out together. After the food was finally done cooking, the couple sat down and ate their great meal at the dining room table while their dogs just stared at them, hoping for some scraps. After they were all done eating, Ted cleared the table and took the dishes into the kitchen. One of the dogs, a Rottweiler named Bart, followed him every step of the way. After Ted rinsed off the dishes, he joined his wife on the couch in the front room. He draped his arm around her shoulder and she leaned her head on his chest as they began to watch TV. They spent the night flipping between channels, really only half paying attention most of the time. They just talked about things at the jewelry store and also how their son and his girlfriend seemed to be getting pretty serious. Even though their 19-year-old son only lived about 2 hours away in College Station, Texas, and they saw him often. It still felt strange to be empty nesters, not to have him in the house anymore. Before they knew it, they had spent hours just sitting there talking, and they had both begun to feel tired. So Ted flipped off the TV and the couple headed to their bedroom with both of their trusty dogs trotting along right behind them. A little before 4 a.m. on March 2nd, 2018, so several hours after Ted and Corey had gone to bed, they both suddenly woke up to the sound of their dogs barking in their room. Ted flipped on the light on his bedside table, and he and his wife looked over and saw their dogs barking away, standing right by the bedroom door. Ted tried to get them to calm down, but they just kept on barking over and over again. Ted could see his wife looked frightened, and he was feeling a bit freaked out too. The dogs were both really good guard dogs, and they usually only got agitated when they'd heard something. And so Ted slowly got out of bed, opened the drawer on the bedside table, and pulled out a .45 caliber handgun. He checked to make sure it was loaded, and then told his wife to stay in the room. Ted walked over to the door, opened it up, and headed outside. He made his way into the dark kitchen, and Bart, the Rottweiler, followed right behind. Just a few minutes later, Corey threw open her closet door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut behind her. She crouched down in the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible. And as she sat there panting, out of breath, she clutched her phone in one hand, and in the other hand she was holding a .357 caliber revolver. She dialed 911 on her phone and pressed it to her ear, and at the same time, she held the gun out in front of her, aimed at the closet door in case anybody approached her. She heard the sound of the emergency operator on the other line, and she said the police needed to get to her house right away. Multiple gunshots had been fired. She didn't know if her husband was even alive at this point, and she said she was sure she would be dead within seconds. 15 minutes later, so just after 5, Jarvis County Homicide Detectives James Moore and Paul Saylor headed up the long walkway toward Ted and Corey's front door. By this point, crime scene tape had already been stretched across the large property. Several uniformed police officers stood on the lawn, and 2 officers stood near the front door with Corey, who was there in her nightgown, sobbing. Detectives Moore and Saylor introduced themselves to Corey and told her they'd be back to her shortly. Then they put on their gloves and headed inside of her house. Just standing in the front room, both detectives got a sense of how big this house was and how many different hallways and paths there were to take. They made their way through the front room and walked into the kitchen, where a team of forensics officers were already searching for evidence. On the floor, sprawled out under the kitchen table, the detectives saw Ed Shaughnessy's body. Blood covered his face and his chest. But the detectives also saw something that completely threw them off, because in the call they got, they'd already been told about Ted being deceased. But they didn't expect to also see his pet dog lying right there with him. Bart, the Rottweiler, had clearly been shot and killed, laying just a few feet in front of Ted, like he'd been trying to maybe protect him. One of the forensics officers joined Detectives Moore and Saylor and pointed out multiple bullet casings littering the kitchen floor. In fact, there were so many casings that the detectives thought it looked like a massive shootout had taken place right there in the kitchen. The detectives walked over to the kitchen table and knelt down by Ted's body. Near his outstretched hand, they saw a .45 caliber handgun gun. Moore checked the magazine and saw it was full, so it appeared like Ted had not fired a single shot from his weapon. However, Moore asked the forensics officer if there was any chance that Ted maybe did fire off some shots and actually emptied out a magazine and then reloaded. And then once it was reloaded, maybe he didn't fire again, giving the impression he had not shot at all. Now, Moore didn't think this was likely, but he just wanted to be sure. The forensic officer told him they were still looking at everything, but so far, none of the casings they'd found matched the caliber of Ted's gun. So, very likely Ted did not fire a single shot. After spending some time searching the kitchen and also studying Ted's wounds, Moore and Saylor began to make their way through the rest of the house. They found a home security system that was not armed, and they didn't find any evidence of forced entry at the front, back, or side doors. They thought maybe whoever had killed Ted had been invited inside the home or, at the very least, had a key. However, as soon as they stepped into one of the bedrooms, they immediately began to rethink that theory. Based on the way the room was decorated, it appeared to belong to a young man. But more importantly, when they looked inside this room, they could see that one of the windows was open and the window screen had been removed and dropped down onto the ground just outside. Moore and Saylor went back to the kitchen and told the forensics officers what they just found. And as members of the forensics team headed to that bedroom, the detectives made their way to the front of the house and walked outside. They saw Ed's wife, Corey, still standing with the two officers. They approached her and gently asked if she was up to answering a few questions. Corey wiped some tears away from her face, but then nodded and said she was. And so Detective Saylor asked her if she could just walk them through what had happened that morning. Corey said that she and her husband had woken up some time around 4:00 a.m. when they heard their dogs barking. Ted had grabbed his gun and walked out with one of the dogs, while she had stayed back in the bedroom with the other dog. But then, she said she heard gunshots coming from the kitchen, so she grabbed her own gun and ran out of the bedroom. She could hear her husband screaming, but there was also this bright light shining directly at her, making it really hard to see. All she could see were shadows moving around in front of her, but then she saw one of these shadows fire a gun and kill one of their dogs. And so instinctively, she raised her own gun and unloaded her weapon, trying to hit the shadow. Detective Saylor asked her what kind of weapon she had, and Corey said she had a .357 revolver. Saylor and Moore looked at each other but didn't say anything. Corey had just admitted she fired her weapon inside the house, and they just found her husband dead from gunshots. So either she was lying and was making this whole thing up about shadows to cover up her part in the crime, or this really happened. Detective Moore asked Corey if one of the bedrooms in the house belonged to a young man. Corey said they must mean her son's room. She said she still had his room, but he was 19 years old now and lived a couple of hours away with his girlfriend. And she'd already asked an officer to call them right after police had arrived and they were on their way right now. Detective Saylor asked Corey if she could give any description of the person she'd fired her gun at, even though it was dark and shadowy. Corey shook her head and said no. She figured it was just a burglar. After all, she and Ted were well known in the area for their jewelry store and for having made a good amount of money. And so they knew they were a target for a robbery. After this, Saylor and Moore stepped away from Corey and headed back inside the house. And already, they were starting to question some of Corey's answers. Like most spouses in murder cases, Corey was immediately considered a suspect, and the fact that her weapon had been fired in the house only made her a stronger one. On top of that, when she called 911, she said she was hiding in the closet and she was sure whoever was inside her house was coming for her house. But when the police had arrived and done a sweep of the house, nobody was there. Finally, Corey had just claimed that she thought this was all a robbery gone bad. However, the detectives had walked through the house and seen stacks of cash, high-end jewelry, and expensive electronics just laying out untouched. And Corey and Ted's safe did not look like anyone had even tried to break into it. So why would a robber leave without taking a single thing of value? Still, the son's bedroom window had been opened, and so if Corey had done that to try to stage things to make it look like a break-in and robbery, she didn't do anything else to the house to back that up. The detectives talked this over as they went back to the son's bedroom. And when they walked in, one of the forensics officers had a smile on his face and he said they had just pulled a really clear fingerprint off the outside of the window, so they hoped that would lead them right to the person who had climbed in. And as Moore and Saylor stood there, something began to hit them. If somebody did really break into the house through this window, climb into this bedroom, and then make their way all the way to the kitchen, they would almost have to have some previous knowledge of the layout of this place. Because even with all the lights on, this was not an easy house to navigate. It was massive and basically like a big labyrinth. So now the detectives felt almost convinced that, even if Ted's wife was not involved, somebody who Ted knew and who had very likely been to this particular house many times must have been his killer house. A couple hours later at 8:00 a.m. on March 2nd, a car pulled up in front of the house. Ted's 19-year-old son, Nicholas, and Nicholas's girlfriend, Jackie Edison, parked behind the line of police guards outside the house that Nicholas had grown up inside of. They both got out of the car and immediately spotted Corey, who was still standing in the front yard, and began running towards her. An officer stopped them, but when they said who they were, he let them by. A moment later, Nicholas and Jackie were hugging Corey, and all three of them just stood there crying. Inside the house, detectives Moore and Saylor got word that Ted's son had just arrived, so they quickly went outside and found Nicholas and Jackie still standing with Corey. The detectives apologized for interrupting, but they asked Nicholas if they could talk to him for a few minutes. Nicholas said of course and then followed the detectives across the yard to a spot where they'd be able to talk without anybody else hearing. Moore started off by asking Nicholas where he'd been around for. 0 a.m. that morning, the time the 911 call had come in, and Nicholas said that he and his girlfriend were asleep at their place in College Station. Jackie was a student at Texas down there, and Nicholas worked trading stocks as a day trader. Moore took down a few notes and then asked Nicholas if there was anyone he could think of who had a problem with his father and might have wanted to do this, but Nicholas shook his head and said basically everybody who knew his parents loved them. Moore asked if there was anything at all about Nicholas's dad that he could think of that could maybe help them, even if it was really small. Nicholas thought about it for a few seconds and then, suddenly, his eyes went wide, like he just remembered something. He said there was one thing that could be important, but it was a really weird situation. When he'd still been living at home, his next-door neighbor had come to him and said she thought that her husband was cheating on her. This neighbor knew Nicholas was pretty good with technology, so she'd asked if there was any way he could track her husband or something, and she told him she would pay him for his services. Nicholas had felt strange getting involved in something like this, but his next-door neighbor was a nice woman and a good friend of his mother's. So, he had helped her. He had put a tracker on her husband's car and followed him one night to another woman's house, and it became clear pretty quickly that the man was cheating on his wife. Now Nicholas got a worried look on his face. He'd always assumed the husband never knew he was involved in helping the wife catch him cheating, but if this man had found out it was him, he might have wanted revenge and his dad might be dead because of it. After that, the detectives told Nicholas he could go rejoin his mother. After he had walked off, the two men just looked at each other and shook their heads in disbelief. That was a really weird story. Neither of them had ever run into a teenager who had acted like a private investigator to catch a cheating husband. It almost sounded made up, or like something the kid might have watched on TV, but regardless, it was a good lead. After Moore and Saylor finished up their initial work at Ted and Corey's house, they walked next door to the neighbor's house. They knocked on the front door and a woman answered, and quickly she invited them inside. They all sat down at her kitchen table and the detectives didn't waste any time. They needed to know if Nicholas's wild story about trailing this woman's husband was true. The woman looked a little embarrassed, but she said Nicholas was telling the truth. She felt bad for dragging a teenager into her marital problems, but she had been desperate. Detective Moore leaned in and told her he did not need all the details about her marriage, but he needed to know one thing. It was extremely important. Had she ever told her husband about Nicholas's involvement in all of this? The woman didn't hesitate. She said no way would she ever do that. Her husband, who had since moved away and was soon to be her ex-husband, had no idea at all about Nicholas. And as she was talking, the reason for this line of questioning finally dawned on her, and she stopped and just said her husband might have cheated on her, but there was no way he would have ever attacked Ted or anybody else like that. The detectives left the house not long after that and headed back to the station. Despite what the woman said about her husband, they knew they still had to track him down and get more information directly from him. In the days following the murder, while members of their investigative team followed up on the neighbor's husband, Moore and Saylor contacted Ted's closest friends to see what else they could learn about him, but not much new came from that. Everybody seemed to like Ted and nobody could understand who would do this, unless it was a robbery. Now, while the detectives still were not convinced Ted's death was the result of a robbery gone wrong, they did start to look more into the jewelry store to see if maybe somebody had been staking the place out and following Ted home. However, they got a phone call from Ted's son, Nicholas, that caused them to quickly change the direction of their investigation. Nicholas was aware that his bedroom window had been found open on the night his father was killed, and he said he just couldn't stop thinking about it. And in fact, there was something he felt like he needed to share with the detectives. He told them when he was younger, he would use his bedroom window to sneak out of the house and then get back inside without his parents knowing. It was just stupid teenager stuff, nothing serious. But He did it so often that he made a habit of just keeping that window unlocked. Now, he realized that particular window might have been left unlocked even after he had moved out. But what Nicholas said was really weighing on him was that there was only really one other person who knew he did this with his window, and that was his friend Spencer Patterson, because he and Spencer had crept out of that window a bunch of times together when Spencer had slept over. Detective Saylor asked Nicholas if the reason he was so worried was because maybe Spencer had some reason to come after Nicholas now. Like, had they had a bad fight or something? Nicholas said no, but he said Spencer would have gone to their house and potentially used that window to get in there and get his parents' money and jewels. Nicholas said Spencer had not really grown up with money of his own, and he'd always been kind of jealous of how wealthy Nicholas's family was. And there was more. Spencer not only knew about the bedroom window, he also knew exactly where to find Nicholas's parents' safe. About a week after the murder, Detective Saylor and Moore sat together in an office, going over the notes they'd already put together. And even though their investigation was still relatively new, they felt like they had some promising leads. They still thought there was a strong chance that Corey had simply shot her husband because, in addition to what they'd learned at the house, they'd now discovered that Corey was the beneficiary of Ted's $1 million life insurance policy. She also stood to gain sole ownership of the jewelry store in the house, which were both worth a ton of money, too. The detectives believed they'd have a clear idea about Corey's potential involvement in the murder when they got the results of the ballistics tests that would, John himself, show if Corey's gun had fired the bullets that killed Ted. But the detectives had also started to consider that maybe Corey had been right, maybe this was a robbery gone bad, and if that was the case, Nicholas's friend Spencer had to be high on their suspect list. Even if this robbery had not actually been successful, Spencer did know that Ted and Corey were wealthy. He knew how to sneak in through Nicholas's window. He knew his way around the maze-like house, and he knew where the safe was. Detective Moore picked up the phone, put it on speaker, and called the number he had for Spencer. Spencer picked up, and Moore quickly introduced himself and then immediately launched into a series of questions. The detectives learned that Spencer had gone over to Ted and Corey's house for dinner about a month ago when Nicholas had been visiting, and they said that they had treated him like he was one of the family, just like they'd done since he was a kid. Moore asked Spencer how he and Nicholas used to sneak out of the house when they were younger, and Spencer talked about using the bedroom window just like Nicholas had said. While the detectives talked to Spencer, they kept getting the feeling like he was holding something back. The kid was being very cooperative and answering their questions, but there just seemed like there was always this hesitation, or like he was about to say something and then chose not to. By the end of the call, Moore and Saylor still did not feel satisfied, so they scheduled an in-person meeting with Spencer. And in the meantime, they decided to keep a close eye on their other major suspect. About a week later, in late March, Nicholas and Jackie were sitting on the couch in the front room of Ted and Corey's house, looking at Corey as she stared out the window onto the street. Nicholas didn't want his mom to be alone, so he told her that he and Jackie would stay at the house as long as they needed to. That had cheered Corey up, but it was clear she was still struggling. And today, Nicholas and Jackie were extra worried about her because she kept standing there just staring out the window. They had no idea why, but suddenly Corey turned around and told them to come over and take a look for themselves. And so Nicholas and Jackie walked over to the window, and Corey pointed to a plain-looking sedan on the street. She told them she thought it was a cop and that he was watching her. At first, this seemed like paranoia to Nicholas and Jackie. However, when Nicholas looked out the window and he got a good look at that car before it drove off, he thought his mom was right. It definitely could be an unmarked police car. Corey stepped away from the window and collapsed onto the couch. She didn't understand why the police would be watching her. Why weren't they out finding the person who had actually killed her husband? Nicholas looked over at his mom and he could tell she was just in total despair. So he leaned over to Jackie and whispered something in her ear. Jackie was surprised by what she just heard, but she quickly smiled and nodded her head. And so Nicholas took Jackie's hand and together they walked over to the couch where Corey was. And then Nicholas took a breath and said that he and Jackie had something very important he wanted to tell her. They were not just boyfriend and girlfriend anymore. They had actually gotten married. Corey instantly sat up and just stared at them for a second, shocked. Nicholas quickly said that they had planned to tell her and Dad when they came to visit next, and they still wanted to have a big ceremony, but they had just decided they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together, and so they had just gotten it done and gotten married. After a tense couple of seconds, Corey broke down in tears, but these weren't tears of joy. She got off the couch, smiled and hugged Jackie, and told her how happy she was to welcome her to the family. Then Corey said Jackie should go pick an engagement ring from their jewelry shop, and then they should have a big engagement party. Even if they were already married, she didn't want her to miss out on anything. And who knows, maybe this was a way for them to start to heal a bit and move forward as a family. Nicholas was very relieved. He was so glad the news had made his mom as happy as he hoped it would. But as excited as she seemed, and as much as they all wanted something to celebrate during this terrible time, Nicholas just couldn't shake the image of that unmarked police car staking out his mother's house. Over the following weeks, the investigative team continued to dig into the Shaughnessy's financial records, and they also did keep eyes on Corey's house. While that was going on, Detectives Moore and Saylor met in person with Nicholas's friend Spencer, and somehow being face-to-face with him made them feel even more like he was hiding something. And it was strange, because on the surface, Spencer seemed cooperative and like he wanted to help. But there was just something about the way this kid spoke that convinced Moore and Saylor that they couldn't fully trust him. So, after meeting with Spencer at the station, the detectives secured warrants to search Spencer's house and his car. Now, the search of the house didn't turn up anything out of the ordinary. However, when they went through Spencer's car, they found a .380 caliber gun. Spencer had never mentioned having this gun, which seemed a little odd since he knew he was being investigated for a shooting. The detectives thought if he had wanted to clear himself, he wouldn't try to hide the fact that he owned a gun. And within days, this new piece of evidence looked a lot more damning, because when ballistics reports came back, they showed that some of the bullets fired at the crime scene came from a .357, which matched Corey's gun, and some of the others came from a .380, just like Spencer's. About a month after Ted's murder, Detectives Moore and Saylor believed they had Ted's killer in their sights. They collected more financial records and cell phone data to try to tie up any loose ends, and then they brought Spencer into the station for one last interview. Spencer sat down at a small table across from Saylor and Moore in a brightly lit, cramped room. He'd always seemed a bit nervous to the detectives, but today he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But despite that, Moore and Saylor didn't go on the attack. Spencer was young and he was nervous and scared, so Moore tried to put him at ease. He told him they thought they knew what happened on the morning Ted died. They just needed Spencer to help them fill in the blanks. And before Spencer could even begin to talk, the detectives confronted him with all the evidence they had in the case, since they told him there really wasn't any point trying to hide anything anymore. After a very tense minute, Spencer looked across the table at the detectives and then told them everything he knew. Following that interview, it would take Moore and Saylor several more weeks to nail everything down. But in May of 2018, 2 months after Ted's murder, they knew exactly what had happened and who had fired the shots that killed Ted Shaughnessy. Based on Spencer's interview, cell phone data, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, here's what police believe happened to Ted in the early morning hours of March 2nd, 2018. On that morning, the killers crept through the dark house, lit only by the light shining from one of their phones. They each held a gun in their hands and they tried to move as slowly and quietly as possible. But when they made it to the kitchen and turned towards the main bedroom, they heard dogs start barking. The killers froze, not sure what to do. One of the dogs sounded really aggressive. The killer holding the phone shined the light towards the bedroom door and, right away, they both saw something moving towards them. As the barking got louder and they heard footsteps and loud clacking on the wooden floors, suddenly the light illuminated the dog, and it was the Rottweiler, Bart, bounding towards them, baring his teeth. One of the killers instinctively raised their gun and fired off a shot. The dog squealed and fell to the kitchen floor. Ted screamed and ran into the kitchen after the dog. He raised his gun, but before he could get a shot off, now both killers started firing. The sound of gunshots crashed through the house as bullets hit Ted in the back, the thigh, in the head. Ted collapsed to the floor under the kitchen table, dead. The killers began shouting at each other, starting to panic. This had not gone the way it was supposed to. But before they could make another move, bullets came whizzing out of the dark into the kitchen, hitting the wall and sending pieces of plaster onto the floor. The killer with the cell phone shined the light in the direction of the gunshots, trying to get a clear look at the shooter. Their hands were shaking and they couldn't really aim well, but still the killers just held their guns and started firing wildly. And then finally, the shots stopped and the kitchen fell silent. One of the killers shouted that they needed to get out of there, so they ran out of the kitchen into one of the bedrooms and climbed out the open window outside. They ran as fast as they could through the darkness back to a car they parked down the street. They got in and one of the killers hit the gas and floored it through the neighborhood while the other killers sat panicking in the passenger seat. They both knew they had screwed up, and now they were going to have to get in touch with the people who had hired them and tell them they'd only taken out one of the intended targets. The killers were the men who had no connection to Ted. However, the two people who hired these men were Ed's own son, Nicholas, and the woman Nicholas had secretly married, Jackie Edison. Nicholas knew if both of his parents were dead, he would inherit their store and their house and benefit from their life insurance policies, all of which would have made him a multimillionaire. And Nicholas really wanted that money because he had gone into quite a bit of debt from playing the stock market as a day trader. So with Jackie's help, he found a hitman and offered to pay them a lot of money to kill both Ted and Corey and to make it look like a robbery. Nicholas told the hitman about his bedroom window and gave them a complete layout of the house. But on the night of the murder, the hitman did not imagine they would find themselves in a full-fledged shootout. So when Corey started firing off her 357 at them, the whole plan fell apart. And so when Corey rushed back to her closet to call 911, instead of the hitman going after her and killing her, they just ran out of the house and didn't even attempt to make it look like a robbery. And then a few hours later, when Nicholas and Jackie arrived at the house, they knew their plan had not worked. So they tried to play the perfect son and daughter-in-law. Nicholas also sent the cops after the neighbor's husband and his close friend, Spencer. The neighbor's husband was cleared as a suspect very quickly, but Spencer remained high on the suspect list, just like Corey was for a significant amount of time. However, when ballistics tests came back, they confirmed that none of the bullets fired from Corey's gun had actually struck Ted, and that the gun that was found in Spencer's car had not been used in the murder. And that fingerprint that had been found on the bedroom window did not match Spencer's, in fact. It just turned out to be an old print from when the window had been manufactured. So the detectives no longer believed Spencer committed the murder, and the more they talked to Spencer, the more they realized he wasn't hiding something to protect himself. He was hiding something to protect his best friend, Nicholas. But in his final meeting with police, Spencer would admit that Nicholas had talked to him on several occasions about wanting to murder his parents and hiring hitmen to do it. And after this, when police dug deeper into Nicholas's phone records, they found a couple of things that sealed the case. Nicholas, being the family member who was the most tech-savvy, set up an app on his phone that enabled him to control the alarm system on his parents' house. And the second discovery, and the far more damning one, was a series of text messages between Nicholas and Jackie in which the two of them were clearly arranging a murder for hire. Nicholas and both shooters were sentenced to 35 years in prison. Jackie cut a plea deal and received 10 years of probation, but with one very specific caveat. She had to spend 2 nights in jail every year on the anniversary of Ted's murder. On a day in 2001, a veteran homicide detective put on his gloves and stepped into a cluttered bedroom. He'd been working on a murder case for months, but he still had no clear evidence pointing to any of the suspects. However, a tip from an informant had led him to this bedroom, and he hoped he'd find something useful there. The detective searched the room and, at first, nothing stood out to him, that is, until he saw a piece of notebook paper sitting on a nightstand. On this paper was somebody's list of goals they wanted to accomplish in their life. The detective scanned the list. Most of the goals on the list were pretty standard, except for one, which was totally psychotic. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, Please hide a tiny speaker in the ceiling of the follow button's bedroom and then play It's a Small World After All on repeat every time the follow button tries to fall asleep. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just after midnight on August 31st, 2001, 36-year-old Dana Laskowski sat on her couch, sipping a drink at her home in Puget Sound, Washington, which is about 35 miles outside of Seattle. Dana had been enjoying a night at home by herself, but as she sat there on the couch, the silence in the house started to feel a bit unsettling. It just was not something she had gotten used to yet. Dana was the mother of 9-year-old triplets, so the house was typically filled with a lot of noise. But tonight, the kids were 3 hours away staying with their dad. Dana and her husband, Stan, had separated the previous year, and after the separation, Dana had moved several hours away to Puyallup, where some of her family lived. Dana and Stan had tried hard to effectively co-parent the triplets. She loved the idea. She loved that the kids still had a good relationship with their father, but not having them around all the time had been a huge transition for Dana. Dana grabbed the remote off the coffee table and turned on the TV, just to have some background noise. She sipped her drink and then kind of laughed at herself. Spending a night on her own really should not be that big of a deal. It should be fun, it should be enjoyable. And plus, even though her triplets would be gone for a few more days, still, Dana worked as a nanny for a couple in town and she'd be able to spend time with their kids, who she loved to. And so Dana told herself to just relax and enjoy a stress-free night. Then she leaned back on the couch and tried to watch TV. But as she was doing that, she suddenly heard this noise coming from the back of the house. She put her drink down, turned off the TV, and then walked out of the room towards the back door. She expected to see her 17-year-old niece, Amanda, and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, standing in the hall, because Dana always kept her back door unlocked for these two teenage girls. Amanda and Emily both had strained relationships with their families, so Dana had become a kind of surrogate mother to both of them. She let them use her house to do laundry, take showers, or to just have a place they could come where they would feel taken care of. But when Dana reached the back of the house, she didn't see the girls standing in the hall. She walked to the back door and glanced outside onto the back porch, but she didn't see anybody there either. She figured she must be hearing things. Being home alone could do that after all. So, she left the back door unlocked in case the girls did show up later, and then turned back around and headed back to the couch. Even though it was late, Dana suddenly thought about giving her niece a call, just to check in on her. The last time she'd seen Amanda and her friend Emily, they had been spending almost all their time with this group of teenage guys who called themselves the Park Rats, because they always hung around at the same public park. Dana tried to keep an open mind and not judge, but she couldn't help but worry about two young women spending time with a group of guys who did not seem to have any ambition in life, and she knew for a fact that some of the Park Rats had pretty serious drug problems. On top of that, Amanda and Emily were both relatively small girls, and Dana knew they really couldn't protect themselves if any of the guys ever tried to get physical with them. Dana sat down on the couch, still debating if she should call Amanda. However, before she could make up her mind, she heard something at the back door again. Then she heard footsteps coming down the hall. At 10:00 a.m. the following morning, a patrol officer from the Puyallup Police Department pulled up in front of Dana's house. He'd gotten a message from dispatch about an urgent 911 call that had come in that morning. A woman had called and said her children's nanny, Dana Laskowski, had not arrived at the house when she was supposed to. The woman and her husband had both called Dana but couldn't get a hold of her, and this really worried them because Dana would never not show up without calling and making sure the kids would be okay. So the woman had asked the police to please do a wellness check on Dana. The officer stepped out of his cruiser and glanced around the neighborhood. This was a pretty busy area of town with lots of fast food restaurants and shops nearby, so the street could see plenty of traffic at night. The officer walked up to Dana's front door and knocked, while calling out her name and also introducing himself. But after a few moments, he didn't get a response, and he also didn't hear any movement inside the house. And so eventually, the officer walked around to the side of the house and pressed his face against a window. However, The curtains inside the house made it difficult to see anything inside. So he walked around to the back of the house, and there he noticed the back door was cracked open. He slowly walked up the steps of the old wooden porch, approached the door, and then called out for Dana again through the crack. But there was still no response. The officer tensed up. He had no idea if this was an innocent mistake by Dana leaving the door open, or if maybe somebody had broken into her house. And if it was the latter, the intruder could still be inside. And so the officer unholstered his gun, pushed the door open, and stepped into the house. As he did this, he walked past an open door and glanced inside. It was a bedroom, and it looked like it had been ransacked. Dresser drawers were open and clothes had been thrown all over the floor. But he didn't see anybody in the room. And so the officer kept heading down the hallway, getting more and more tense as he moved. He eventually reached the front room and stepped inside, and there he found more pieces of clothing on the floor, but he still didn't see anybody. The officer reached for his radio, about to call in a potential burglary, when he looked over at the couch, and immediately what he saw there told him he was dealing with something far worse than just a break-in. A little later that morning, veteran homicide detective Scott Bramhall of the Pilot Police Department arrived at Dana's house. He saw a patrol officer standing out front, waiting for him. Bramhall could tell this officer was shaken up by what he found inside. Detective Bramhall talked to the officer and got as much information as he could. Then he put on his gloves and stepped inside. Bramhall walked into the front room of the house and immediately saw what had upset the patrol officer. The dead body of a woman lay on the couch with a blanket partially covering her legs, almost like she'd been keeping her feet warm. The patrol officer had found a photo during his search, and he had positively identified the woman as Dana Laskovsky, the woman he had come to do the wellness check on. Detective Bramhall approached Dana's body and crouched down beside it. Right away, he saw specks of blood on her cheeks and mouth, as well as blood on the carpet by the couch. He also saw deep, dark bruises and ligature marks on Dana's throat. Bramhall looked around the room and saw a scarf on the floor not far from the couch, and his first thought was Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and that scarf could very well be the murder weapon. But the position Dana was lying in was by far the most shocking thing about this crime scene. Dana's head rested on one of her arms, but her other arm was bent at a strange angle behind her back, and her waist was twisted in an awkward position, like her body was contorted. The result of all this was that, even in death, Dana appeared like she was actively in some kind of physical struggle. Just then, the detective heard voices and footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned to see more police officers and a small group of forensic technicians walking into the room. Bramhall waved one of the forensic techs over, and the two of them began examining Dana's body together. The tech agreed that Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and the severity of the wounds on her throat indicated that whoever had killed her was pretty strong. Also, Detective Bramhall knew that in a lot of cases of strangulation, the victim fights back really aggressively, thrashing and fighting as much as they can, giving further credibility to the idea that Dana's killer really did have Dana's killer, to be big and strong to be able to overpower her. After a few moments, Bramhall left the forensic tech and searched the rest of the house with a few other officers. He told a member of his team to get started on a background check for Dana, while other officers went out to speak with Dana's neighbors to see if any of them had seen or heard something strange that morning or the night before. As the detective made his way through Dana's house, it was clear the place had been ransacked. However, he noticed that some pretty obviously expensive items, like a computer and other electronics, had been left untouched. This could mean a couple of different things. Either someone had robbed Dana's house looking for something specific like jewelry, or this entire scene had been staged to look like a robbery. Another thing that stood out to Bramhall was that even though Dana's body and the blood indicated a struggle, there was no sign of forced entry. The back door had been opened and unlocked when the patrol officer had first arrived on the scene, and the front door had been locked and showed no signs of a break-in. So Bramhall wondered if Dana had let her killer inside or if they had unlocked the back door with their own key. As Bramhall was searching the house, one of his team members came up to him. This officer told him that he'd only just started looking into Dana's background, But already he'd found something important. She and her husband, Stan, her husband, were recently separated, and Stan was not answering his phone. That night, after Detective Bramhall had spent hours at Dana's house, he got back to the police station and he was already feeling antsy. Dana's husband, Stan, like any murder victim's spouse, would basically automatically be a major suspect under almost any circumstance. However, in the few hours since Bramhall had begun working this case, Stan had started to look like the perfect suspect. Stan had not responded to the multiple calls the pilot police had made throughout the day. And when Detective Bramhall had reached out to police in the town where Stan lived, they actually went by his house and there had been no sign of Stan or the triplets. Now, Detective Bramhall did not want to jump to conclusions here. However, he couldn't ignore what might be going on here. A man killing his estranged wife so he could have sole custody of their kids was actually a fairly common thing. Still, Bramhall couldn't do anything until they actually tracked Stan down. So, the detective stayed in touch with the police in Stan's town, and he also contacted the Washington State Police to tell them to be on the lookout for Stan. In the meantime, Bramhall started to gather information on Dana's friends, family, and her employers. Now, he was already planning on interviewing everybody close to Dana, but if Stan didn't turn up soon, he hoped maybe one of them would be able to help police track him down. But the following morning, before Bramhall had met with anybody else, he got a phone call in his office. And as soon as he answered, he heard the voice of a man who sounded upset and a bit frightened. It was Dana's husband, Stan. Stan explained that he had just taken his kids camping and had been at a spot out in the woods that didn't get cell service. So when he'd left the campsite earlier that morning, he saw he had tons of voice messages from the police, and when he had called the cops back, he learned that his estranged wife had been murdered. And then after that, the police had connected him to Detective Bramhall. There was no question in Bramhall's mind that Stan was a major suspect. However, as Stan was innocent, Bramhall could not imagine a worse way to have gotten such horrific news. Bramhall told Stan they needed to talk right now in person, and so Bramhall said he would just drive over to Stan's house right now. Stan said okay, and so Detective Bramhall hung up and then told members of his team to begin looking into Dana's friends and family. Then Bramhall got in touch with the local police where Stan lived to say he was going there to interview him, and then he headed out to interview him. The 5-hour doctor led Bramhall through the woods and hills of the Pacific Northwest, and as he drove, it hit Bramhall just how slow-going this trip really was. He wondered if Stan had gotten angry about having to make this doctor just to see his kids. Maybe he'd gone to Dana's house and confronted her about it. If they'd gotten into a fight. Stan could have flown into a rage and killed her. Now this was just a theory. But when Bramhall finally got to Stan's house along with the local officer and they met Stan at the front door, Bramhall's theory didn't seem too far-fetched. Because Stan was a big guy, he could have easily overpowered Dana. But, more importantly, Bramhall noticed straight away that Stan had scrape marks on both of his legs, a sign that perhaps he had a recent physical altercation with someone. Stan led Bramhall and the other officer into his house and they all sat down together in the kitchen. Bramhall didn't waste any time. He asked Stan flat out if he and Dana had been arguing about their separation and if that tension had led to any physical altercations. Stan immediately shook his head and said no. He didn't deny that he and Dana argued and that being separated and trying to co-parent triplets could be stressful. But he said he and Dana had worked hard to help each other and to support each other and to make their kids' lives as normal as possible. Bramhall immediately changed the subject and asked Stan how he'd gotten those scrapes on his legs. Stan looked a little surprised by the question, but he said he'd gotten them while playing baseball. Bramhall jotted it down in his notebook, having no sense of whether or not he was actually getting the truth. Finally, Bramhall asked Stan if he'd be willing to submit a DNA sample, and at that, Stan's whole demeanor changed. He'd been cooperative the entire time, but now, he said there was no way he was going to provide DNA. He still didn't really know what was going on here, and he hadn't even talked to a lawyer. Bramhall knew he couldn't force Stan to give them a DNA sample, not yet at least. He also knew a lot of people, even innocent people, didn't like the idea of providing their DNA. So Bramhall stood up, said he'd check into Stan's camping trip alibi, and that he'd be in touch. Hours later, Bramhall made it back to the station and he felt like nothing had really changed regarding Stan. Stan was still a major suspect, and since he hadn't provided a DNA sample, the police would just have to keep digging into his alibi and his background to see if they could find anything that directly connected him to the murder. However, within minutes of getting back to the police station, one of Bramhall's team members came into his office and told him he had a major new lead. Detective Bramhall was worn out from all that driving he'd just done, but he felt an instant rush when he heard this. He asked the officer what he'd found. The officer said he'd spoken to the couple who employed Dana as their nanny, and they said Dana had a stalker, a guy named William. And Dana had even said to her employers that if she ever turned up dead, William would be the one who had killed her. On the evening of September 2nd, 2 days after Dana's body had been found, Detective Bramhall sat inside of an interview room across the table from Dana's alleged stalker, William. It would turn out William had installed cabling at Dana's house a few months earlier, and since then, he'd been leaving notes and poems on Dana's front door, and he'd been seen lurking around her house a bunch of times by several of Dana's neighbors. Police also found a string of harassing messages from William on Dana's phone, and so all of that had been enough for Bramhall to secure a search warrant. And the search of William's house had led to a disturbing discovery. Inside the interview room, Detective Bramhall pulled out a notebook and put it on the table. Then he asked William if he recognized it. William lowered his head and then nodded. He said it was his personal journal. Bramhall flipped open the notebook and showed William what appeared to be a letter to an unnamed woman. And this letter was filled with all these violent things William wanted to do to her. Bramhall flipped to another page, which was another letter to the same unnamed woman, filled with even more anger and more threats of violence. And so Detective Bramhall said it looked to him like William had been obsessed with Dana, leaving her notes and poetry and spying on her at her house. And when Dana didn't reciprocate, he got angry and started fantasizing about hurting her and began writing about it in his journal. But as William heard this, he just shook his head and said, "No, it's not like that at all." William said those letters were an exercise his therapist had told him to do, and they weren't even about Dana. He said he had written that stuff about a woman who'd broken his heart, but it was just to get out the anger and hurt that he felt. He would never actually do any of the stuff he had written. Bramhall sat there in silence for a minute, just looking at the man across the table. Like Dana's husband, William was easily big enough to have overpowered Dana, and even if William was telling the truth about the notebook, he clearly had some kind of unhealthy obsession with Dana. So Bramhall leaned in and told William there was a really easy way for him to clear his name and help the police figure out what happened to Dana. William could provide the police with his phone and a DNA sample. And William didn't hesitate. He said he would do whatever the police needed, anything that would show he did not hurt Dana. In the days following the interview with William, Detective Bramhall and his team met with more of Dana's friends and family. Bramhall had the solid suspects, Stan, the estranged husband, and William, the stalker. But he still didn't have any clear evidence pointing to either of them, on most of the people he spoke to didn't provide much more information. But Bramhall eventually met with Dana's 17-year-old niece, Amanda, at her house, and she told him something that had the potential to turn his whole investigation on its head. Amanda told Bramhall that Dana was like a second mother to her and her best friend, Emily. Dana let them come over whenever they wanted, and the house was like this great escape for them. Amanda said Dana even left her back door unlocked, just so they could come in whenever they wanted to. This was a huge piece of news for Bramhall. It now made sense how somebody could have gotten into Dana's house without actually having to break in. They just walked in the unlocked back door. But then Amanda said something else that seemed even bigger. She explained that she and Emily had become friends with a bunch of teenagers who called themselves the Park Rats, and Bramhall knew exactly who they were. And he knew some of them were bad news. More than a few Park Rats had ended up in jail for drugs and violent crimes. And so as soon as Bramhall heard this, he asked Amanda if any of the Park Rats knew that her aunt kept her back door unlocked. And Amanda nodded and said yes. She said she had actually brought a couple of the Park Rats to Dana's house to meet her, just because Amanda thought Dana was so good at taking care of people who didn't really have anybody else, and most of the Park Rats had very difficult home lives. Detective Bramhall left Amanda's house and laid out his next steps. So far, his case had seemed like a pretty straightforward case. Estranged husbands and stalkers were common suspects, but now he and his team were going to have to track down and interrogate a local gang of teenagers. Finding the park rats didn't prove to be too difficult for Detective Bramhall. A few trips to the public park where they hung out and meeting with a couple members of the group who were now in jail was really all it took. But getting the park rats to actually give him useful information turned out to be a lot harder. Most of them said they knew about Dana's murder, but all of them denied having anything to do with it. And since Bramhall didn't have any evidence connecting these teenagers to the scene, he couldn't just arrest them and try to force them to talk. And so, before long, a month had just flown by and Bramhall still didn't have anything. And in that time, no new evidence surfaced that pointed to either Dana's husband, Stan, or the stalker, William. And so Bramhall began to worry that maybe Dana's death had been the result of a random burglary gone wrong and that the police were not even close to tracking down her killer. On October 4th, 2001, so third eye for days after Dana's murder, her friends and family finally gathered for her funeral. Because of the ongoing investigation, police had waited longer than usual to release the body back to the family. But now a funeral home in town was packed with people who had come to express how much they loved and missed Dana, and how much she had been there for them. Detective Bramhall and some members of his team attended the funeral, watching to see if anyone might do something that jumped out at them. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was just a group of people grieving the loss of a loved one. After the service was over, Bramhall secured the funeral memorial book, which had been signed by the people who had attended. Bramhall hoped that he could find someone in this book that could maybe offer his investigation a new lead. So Bramhall and his team brought the book back to the station and they went through it. And as they did, they saw some people, in addition to signing it, also left written notes. And one of these written notes totally floored Bramhall. After reading the note several times, Bramhall felt confident he had just found a massive clue. Bramhall and his team quickly met with the person who had written this note, and what that person said led police right back to the park rats. Over the next several weeks, armed with new information from this memorial book, Detective Bramhall tracked down several of the park rats. He'd already met with the park rats, and they were willing to cooperate. All of them still maintained they had nothing to do with Dana's murder, but they said there was somebody the police needed to talk to. It was someone they all knew and who they called the Mutant. Bramhall thought the Mutant definitely sounded like a nickname a group of teenagers would come up with, like something out of a comic book. But the park rats said the Mutant was more like a name for a professional wrestler, because the Mutant was really strong and loved to wrestle. And like all professional wrestlers, the Mutant had a signature move, choking their opponent, twisting them at the waist, then bending their arm all the way behind their back. When Detective Bramhall heard about this signature wrestling move, immediately images of the bizarre position he'd found Dana's body in ran through his mind. And so the detective and his team spent the next several days compiling background information, and then they brought the Mutant in for an interview. And by the end of that interview, Detective Bramhall knew who had killed Dana Laskowski. Based on information from the Mutant, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dana not long after midnight on August 31st, 2001. That night, the killer and their partner moved quietly through the darkness towards the back door of Dana's house. Once they got there, they opened it up, walked inside, and began walking down the hallway towards the front room. When they got there, they saw Dana standing by the couch, but before she could say anything, the killer demanded that Dana give them some money. Dana stayed calm and said she was sorry but didn't have any money. But the killer immediately snapped back and said Dana needed to hand over some cash right now. Dana repeated that she didn't have any money, and then she asked the killer and their partner to please just leave. But the killer wasn't having it. They walked over to Dana, they grabbed her, and shouted that they wanted her money now. Dana tried to push the killer off, but the killer was too strong. Dana screamed, and this only set off the killer even more. They hit Dana in the face and then slammed her to the floor. Dana tried to get up off the floor, but the killer just leapt on top of her and rolled her over onto her stomach. Then the killer saw one of Dana's scars laying on the arm of the couch, and they grabbed it. Then, before Dana could do anything, they wrapped that scarf around Dana's neck and began choking her. Dana kicked and flailed, but the killer fought off her attack while the killer's partner just stood there watching. The killer kept choking Dana with the scarf in one hand and then, with their other hand, they grabbed Dana's arm and they yanked it violently backwards, twisting her around at the waist. Dana tried to scream louder, but now she was gasping for air and, slowly, Dana's eyes went wide and she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the floor. The killer let go of the scarf and Dana's arm and they stood up. They stared down at Dana's body and then over at their partner, who was still just standing there in a daze. Then, the killer picked Dana up. The scarf fell to the floor as the killer laid Dana on the couch, still in her twisted position with her arm pinned behind her back. The killer then grabbed a folded-up blanket from the edge of the couch and covered Dana's feet and part of her legs with it, almost like they were tucking her in. But after the killer stepped away from the couch and kind of surveyed the scene, it was like they began to panic. They yelled at their partner that they needed to make this look like a robbery. The two of them quickly ran to Dana's bedroom and threw open all the drawers and littered the floor with clothing. They also carried some more clothes into the front room and dumped those on the floor as well. And then they ran out of the room, down the hall, and out the back door, the same back door that Dana had always left unlocked, just for them, so they could always come to her house to escape their troubles at home. The people responsible for Dana's murder were Dana's own niece, Amanda, and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, who all of the park rats knew as the mutant. The two young women had gone to Dana's house to try to get Dana to give them some money, and when she refused, it was Emily the mutant who attacked and killed her. Emily had not been high on the suspect list because, on the surface, she did not fit the profile of the killer. Police had assumed that the killer was a man who was bigger and stronger than Dana, and Emily was a small young woman who was only about 5'2". But it would turn out, despite her small size, Emily was extremely strong and loved to wrestle, hence how she got the nickname, the Mutant. The note that Detective Bramhall saw in Dana's funeral memorial book that really stood out to him was written by Dana's niece, Amanda, and it read, "Dade, I'm sorry I wasn't a better niece for you. Third eye for days clean and sober. It's all for you." The funeral was held exactly third eye for days after Dana's murder, suggesting Dana's murder prompted Amanda to go sober on that same day. Now, that in and of itself is not totally unreasonable, that a death in the family would prompt a big life change. However, to Bramhall, as he was reading through the notes, that note just felt weirdly specific to reference her sobriety and the exact number of days inside of this memorial book, when all the other notes were just far less specific. And so to him, something felt off about it. And so, the detective followed up with Amanda and asked her about the note, and she would admit to him that she had been struggling with drug addiction. And so Bramhall wanted to know if her sudden sobriety was connected to Dana's murder, like the note implied. And Amanda would say yes, and over the course of this discussion, she would also just tell Bramhall that there was this drug dealer in the park rats who might have killed her aunt. However, when Bramhall met with that drug dealer and several other members of the park rats, they all pointed the finger at Emily, the mutant. Police searched Emily's house and found a piece of paper in her room. On it, she had written a list of goals she had, and one of those goals was to, quote, kill someone and get away with it. Emily eventually confessed to the murder and Amanda admitted to being in the house during the murder. Dana's niece and aided the police in prosecution, and so she was not charged with any crime. As for Emily, she would take a plea deal and would only serve about 5.5 years in prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.